Welcome back, dear fiends of the den. After my week off, there was a family wedding, lots to do, beautiful day. It was wonderful to celebrate, and now I am back. And if you didn't answer the poll in the shorts, I asked if you would rather have me talk about an urban legend or a horror movie, and I got a 50-50. So I will be talking about a movie based on an urban legend, and it's from the 80s, and it is not the one you think. Let's dive in. So, this movie's from the 80s, and I was pretty into a lot of the horror movies in the 80s. I thought I wasn't a fan of horror movies for the longest time, but I realized that's mostly what I watch, mostly classic, mostly from Svengoolie on MeTV every Saturday night. If you do not know, you've got to tune in and become part of the coolest horror and sci fi culture cult ever. So you're probably thinking, movie from the 80s based on an urban legend. So you're probably thinking Nightmare on Elm Street or maybe Friday the 13th, but no, it's actually Gremlins. Oh, and do you guys remember Ghoulies? Shout out if you remember Ghoulies. It is on Svengoolie all the time. Like, seriously, once a year, I get to see all three Ghoulies. So let's talk Gremlins. Everyone went wild in the 80s over Gremlins, especially over Gizmo, right? So it's 1984, and what this draws from is this inspiration from a World War II era urban legend, and it literally took flight. And this is among the British Royal Air Force pilots. So, we all know the rules of the gremlins, right? Let's talk about that first for a second because we need to understand the gremlin rules. So anyone who has seen Gremlins or had purchased any of the dolls in 1984, especially a Gizmo doll, wondering if you were going to break any of these three rules and it was going to turn into a gremlin, let's talk about this. So, rule number one of the Mogwai: no bright light because sunlight can kill them. Number two is don't get the Mogwai wet because they will reproduce asexually and they spawn new creatures instantly. And number three, the most important rule that we all know: never feed a Mogwai after midnight because it triggers their transformation into a gremlin. But we know that this is what happened in the movie. It had to happen in the movie. That was the catalyst for the whole thing, right? So let's talk about the legend. So back in the earliest? Sure. Back in the earliest 20th century, I just make up my own words. The Royal Air Force thought that they had these little gremlins that would cause them issues. And the issues on the planes were like, things didn't work, malfunctions, all of these issues that would go on with like jamming of the controls and loosening of bolts. So basically, these gremlins would sabotage the aircraft mid-flight. So these RAF pilots would call them gremlins. Now, the whole thing was these were not goblins and these were not demons. These were small, wiry creatures with claws that cut like wires and eyes that cracked like glass. And these gremlins were born in the belly of warplanes, raised on static and fear. They didn't bleed, they didn't speak, they just dismantled. One pilot in the RAF swore he saw one clinging to the wing during a night flight over the channel. Rain lashed the glass, lighting up its face, half monkey, half man, all malice. It grinned and then tore into the engine casing with glee. The plane limped home. The pilot was grounded. They said he was hallucinating. They said He'd cracked under pressure. But the story spread. Gremlins became the scapegoat for every unexplained failure. Radio shorted out, gremlins. Landing gear jammed, gremlins. A bomber vanished in the Alps, gremlins. So, of course, Hollywood had to take this over. But years later, this legend crawled out of the cockpit into pop culture, and it wasn't Hollywood yet. It was Roald Dahl that gave them the name. And then, of course, Steven Spielberg gave them the teeth. And then in New York, a screenwriter named Chris Columbus heard mice scratching in his apartment in New York City. And he thought, what if they weren't mice? What if they were gremlins? And thus, this legend came to life in Hollywood. Now, for us Gen X, there was a lot to unpack in this movie. I was about 8 years old when it came out. And even though it was a PG-13 rating, there's no way we weren't watching the horror movies. And it just became this iconic movie immediately, mostly because of Gizmo. And then the way the absolutely adorable Gizmo became this crazy violent gremlin after midnight. It was like horror and shock. And then of course it took place during Christmas, and we all saw Phoebe Cates monologue where, if you're 8 years old, you're like, what just happened? Wait, who was in the chimney? So it was, the 80s was a very, very different time. And, you kind of just took those things with a grain of salt. But what these gremlins do remind me of from the RAF legend is that episode of The Twilight Zone with the thing on the wing. And this is also based on the urban legend of the gremlins, and it's called Nightmare at 20,000 Feet. So this aired on October 11th, 1963. It was during the fifth season of The Twilight Zone, and it's one of my favorite episodes. The main character was played by William Shatner. He played a man named Robert Williams, or Wilson, who was on a commercial flight cruising through these stormy skies, and he was like recovering from a nervous breakdown. So he was seeing this gremlin on the wing tearing the plane apart, but he's the only other person who sees it. So in this original episode, the gremlin is a shaggy ape-like figure with a grotesque face, and it's prowling on the wing in the rain. And this matches the description of what the RAF pilot said of half ape, half man, and it's ripping into everything, and no one else sees it but William Shatner's character. And, obviously he's talking about in this episode, like, psychological torment of a man who supposedly had a nervous breakdown. But think about if that RAF pilot really did see this gremlin. It's really incredible to think that these things could actually exist. Now, there is a 1983 film version of this particular Twilight Zone, the movie, starring John Lithgow, where the gremlin was redesigned to be more monstrous and reptilian, and the tension was dialed up dramatically. And this gremlin became a metaphor for unseen threats and personal demons, and it's been parodied in The Simpsons and Saturday Night Live, and referenced in countless horror and sci-fi tributes. So I did not know in 1984 that Gremlins was based on a Royal Air Force urban legend. If you didn't either, let me know in the comments, and let me know which story, urban legend, or horror show, movie, whatever it is, you want me to talk about next. I listen to your comments and I will look everything up. Thank you all so much for joining me in the den. Don't forget, because I bring you the truth, The den has been demonetized, and it's a signal from the shadows. So if you'd like to support the dark entertainment and Rose Noir's investigations, you can do so by tipping the detective. The paypal.me link is in the bio. Again, thank you so much for joining me in the den. If you've got something to say, send me an email at welcometothedenpodcast@gmail.com.